Well, thank you all so much for staying. My goodness, Saturday afternoon, and here we still are. I am very grateful to you. I am going to try, I always say this, but I'm really going to try this time to be briefer. I know that it's been a long day. It's a lot to digest. And I wanted to ask you all to be thinking during this last talk maybe about what your one takeaway is, or I mean, maybe there's more than one, but just one in particular. Or if you have one particular idea going away from here of one thing that you or this organization or another organization that you belong to could do about some of these issues. And maybe in the Q&A we can see if anybody wants to mention either what their one takeaway is or, what their one idea for something to do to put on their to-do list might be. Because I so appreciate and so value all the effort that goes into organizing an event like this, and I realize that our time together is really just the beginning. It's about the process going forward and what we make of all of this. So want to be very action-oriented then in our last discussion. If you feel like participating with me in that, that would be great. So we have talked about the global landscape of fundamentalism and extremism around the world in many different forms and the threats that it is posing to human rights. We looked at one particular example of one particular form of fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism, and the way in which so many people of Muslim heritage, women and men, have worked to challenge that. And now for our last lecture of the day, we're going to look at one particular area where human rights have been really undermined by fundamentalists and extremists in all forms, and that is the area of women's human rights. So our topic this afternoon is women's rights and the global struggle against fundamentalism. And I have to explain this picture, which I love, which was given to me by an Indian research assistant of mine this summer. And it is taken from a movement of women who fought in southern India in Kerala state to have access to a particular temple. And the men wanted to keep them out of this temple. In particular, some Hindu fundamentalists wanted to keep them out of this temple. And the women, including some older women, as you can see in the picture, and including some very religious women, just wanted the right that men assume for themselves, which is to be able to go to that temple as well. And the very amazing thing was how much they mobilized, how many women came out to take part in these protests, and also some men who joined them. And ultimately, as a result of these protests, there was a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of India, and in fact, legally, it was made clear by the Supreme Court that these women have the right to access that particular temple. And they're still struggling in practice to have access to it, but they're now armed with the Supreme Court judgment. But I just love that image of peaceful resistance and determination to access one's equal right to participate in cultural and in religious life. So I like to start with that picture. What we're seeing around the world is that there are many challenges to women's human rights today, but when you look at the work of experts, many of them identify that fundamentalism and extremism, as we've defined them today, are among the leading threats to women's human rights, and this is true in every region of the world. These are certainly not the only problems, but fundamentalism and extremism combine with other factors, such as broader notions of patriarchy, such as negative aspects of various economic models, in a really dangerous alchemy that is eroding women's rights. And I remember being very struck by what an Iraqi woman said to me, which is that for the first time, the granddaughters face sort of lower life prospects than their grandmothers did, whereas, over history it was always meant to be the other way around. So this sense that in many places things are really going backwards on women's rights because of fundamentalism and extremism and in combination with other factors. Fundamentalist and extremist ideologies and the movements and the governments that espouse them are seeking to roll back advances achieved in securing women's equality, are often aiming to block further advances on women's rights, are often trying to penalize and to stigmatize women human rights defenders like these women you see here, who are promoting these critical efforts. And I think it was the recognition of that global reality more than just the election of any one person, that led women all around the world, not just in the United States, estimated at 2.6 million people in 674 marches, to take to the streets around the world on 21 January 2017 in the women's marches. And later that same year, I joined a joint statement with other UN human rights experts, which said that, quote, women's rights are facing an alarming backlash in many parts of the world. We need, more than ever, to protect the fundamental principle that all rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Despite this unbreakable principle, we are witnessing efforts by fundamentalist groups to undermine the foundation on which the whole human rights system is based. Some of these efforts are based on a misuse of culture, including religion and tradition. And I think that, unfortunately, that statement from 2017 remains true until today. And what we see now around the world is that all of these anti-rights trends, whether on the part of states or non-state actors, whether at the international or national levels, must be met with a vigorous international human rights-based challenge, which must center women's human rights, not see them as peripheral or optional, but see them really as at the center of any meaningful effort to challenge fundamentalism and extremism. Now, tackling these issues may seem controversial. A lot of people don't want to talk about this. I get into the UN, they really don't want to talk about this. It's seen as somehow awkward, or you're insulting religion if you talk about it. But what I say to governments is, they actually don't have a choice. They have to talk about these topics. With regard to women, governments around the world have committed in something called the Sustainable Development Goals, or you often hear them called the SDGs, to achieving gender equality around the world by 2030. That's not very far away, right? That's 11 years from now. And there is absolutely no way to achieve gender equality by 2030 without addressing fundamentalism and extremism, given that they are identified as some of the leading threats to women's human rights all around the world today. So this is basically a non-optional discussion. Otherwise, there is simply no meaningful path to women's equality. Now, returning to a theme we talked about this morning, what we find is that at the heart of fundamentalist and extremist paradigms, in particular as it concerns women, are rejections of equality. So the idea that women are equal. Somebody asked me a question about Turkey. The Turkish president has said very clearly that women are not and cannot be equal to men. And a lot of presidents may think this, but it is rather remarkable to have one who says it very openly in an official statement. So we're seeing challenges of equality of women, challenges of the universality of human rights, the idea that universal human rights also apply to women, and we're seeing this in the official positions of governments. So we really have to defend women's human rights, to challenge fundamentalism and extremism. We have to, again, go back to defending the basic idea of equality. It's kind of hard to believe we're still having to defend that idea in 2019, and the basic idea that universal human rights apply to everyone. And I love this quote from Charlotte Bunch, who is founded something called the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University, and she said, "The defense of the universality of rights for women is crucial to any defense of the universality of human rights. If the violation of the rights of half of humanity can be conditional in the name of culture, religion, or nationality, then the rights of anyone can be so conditioned." So really defending the universality of the human rights of women speaks to defending universal rights for everyone. And I think that that is another very important takeaway as well. And I have said again and again, this discussion about women's human rights is not some sort of add-on to the discussion about fundamentalism or extremism or terrorism. Very often governments will tell you, we can't deal with these, social problems like women right now. We are busy. We are fighting fundamentalism. We are fighting extremism. We are combating terrorism. But what you actually find, I think, is that the struggle for women's rights and for women's equality is right at the center of any meaningful struggle against fundamentalism and extremism, especially because so many of these fundamentalist movements target women's rights. And I love this. I'll come back to this slide, but I love this wonderful quote from Zainabou Hadari, who was a feminist from Niger and women's rights advocate. And she said, every step forward for women's rights is a piece of the struggle against fundamentalism. And I think that that is so absolutely true. And at the UN, I see it all too often. Governments will allow women to have their silo, right? You can go off and talk about women's rights in your side meeting, but don't bother us here in the Security Council where we're talking about the real issues. I think the real challenge is to really mainstream the discussion about women's human rights into the broader international program of work on fundamentalism and extremism. What's interesting, and again, this repeats a theme that we saw this morning, and I'll go back to this slide. What's interesting, again, is that the different manifestations of fundamentalism often display notable similarities in their interpretations of gender roles and family. Patriarchy is manifest in many religions, but it takes on a much more extreme form in fundamentalism, which often entirely rejects substantive equality between women and men. And at the heart of fundamentalist agendas, we see the effort to control women, to suppress women's rights, to circumscribe women's roles, and indeed men's roles at the same time. And sometimes these agendas go so far as to promote the segregation of women, which makes it difficult for women to participate equally in cultural life, in political life, in social life, and in the making and evolution of culture. Gender-based laws and policies promoted by fundamentalist groups are often based on stereotyped and sexist ideas about gender relations, which clearly discriminate against women and girls. And so the human rights approach to fundamentalism and extremism that I talked about this morning has to absolutely put at its center a commitment to women's human rights. It also has to tackle both the attitudes of states and non-state actors vis-a-vis women. So one thing that I have really not understood is that how certain governments that espouse views about women, including systematic discrimination against women, which are very similar to the views of violent extremist armed groups about women, how those governments think they can somehow be leading the fight against terrorism. So I found it very ironic when one of the UN's counterterrorism centers was located in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, it's changing a little bit now, and that's a positive thing, but Saudi Arabia has practiced open, de jure, systematic segregation of and discrimination against women in a way that is rather similar to what some of the armed fundamentalist and terrorist groups that we are seeing today have suggested. So I think if these governments are really serious in their commitment to combating extremism, they are going to have to change their own discriminatory policies. And that is, I think, very important indeed. Now, as we saw this morning, and as I'm going to talk about again in a moment, we see in this area as well that it is the human rights defenders, it's the human rights activists and advocates, it's the civil society organizations that have been at the forefront of recognizing, documenting, and opposing fundamentalist and extremist abuses against women. Governments did not really sort of lead this. Governments very often came very late to this struggle. It was women on the ground, like these women you see here, and let me tell you the story of this slide. So you may remember the fatwa, the religious order issued against the author Salman Rushdie over his book, The Satanic Verses. This is a photograph from a demonstration held in London where there has been a lot of sort of fundamentalist activism, unfortunately, and in fact where the first idea of getting the Iranian government to issue a fatwa against Salman Rushdie sort of came into being. But this is a demonstration in London of South Asian women, South Asian anti-racist feminist activists, against the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And you see the banner there, Women Against Fundamentalism, Our Tradition, Struggle, Not Submission. You see the one over here, Religious Leaders Do Not Speak for Us, and the one in the back, Rushdie's Right to Write, Our Right to Read. It is really, and these women stood in this sort of terrible situation back in the 80s with, on the one hand, sort of the police, very large police presence, very large pro-fundamentalist demonstration that was supporting the fatwa against Rushdie. And then there was also a far-right racist presence in this demonstration that was demonstrating against the Muslim fundamentalists. And these women protesters sort of found themselves in a phalanx in the middle of all of that, but they stood their ground. And I think we see this again and again, that, you know, it's the women activists who are often standing up to fundamentalism first. And I found this when I went to write the book that I talked about in my last lecture, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. The single longest chapter is about women's rights advocates. In fact, there could have been an entire second chapter about this, but my editor wouldn't allow it. That way, you're only supposed to have 10 chapters. That would have been 11 chapters. But every country that I went to, and I asked people, who should I talk to? They always said first, the women's rights activists. They were the first ones to recognize this problem. They were the first ones to be out there protesting against it. And I think it's, again, unfortunate, as I said earlier, that the international community doesn't listen enough to these women. They are not invited to the big international meetings about extremism and violent extremism, and I think that that really has to change. They have done some incredibly creative things on the ground. So some of the women who were involved in this protest, for example, later started a journal. There's an entire journal in Britain now called Feminist Dissent, which the whole journal is just focused on analyzing the impact of different forms of fundamentalism on women. They're also looking at the rise of the far right in Britain now. So taking this advocacy really into theory and into trying to have a voice in the academic debate. And unfortunately, these sorts of forces don't get all of the resources and the support that they need. These women human rights defenders confronting fundamentalists need resources, they need structures, they need visibility, they need access to media outlets so that their efforts can crystallize into a kind of systematic and institutionalized opposition to fundamentalism. But fundamentalism is, as I said earlier, a really dangerous issue to work on. Let me find the slide I was looking for. I'll just stop there for now. It's a really dangerous issue to work on and a daunting issue to work on, leading women human rights defenders sometimes to be labeled as opponents of their religious group or nation. Actually, I can then show you the slide. So, for example, this is a slide. Somebody asked me, how do you spell catolicadas? Here is Catolicadas. This is a slide from Catholics for Free Choice Mexico from the wonderful animated series that they did called Catolicadas, which you can find on YouTube, including it has English subtitles. But doing this kind of work where you have a dialogue between a priest and a nun about, as you see here, contraception, about homosexuality, about a whole range of social issues, this can get you very easily labeled an enemy of your religion, when in fact what you think it is that you're trying to do may well be to defend a kind of a humanistic or tolerant face of that tradition. So doing this work can indeed be very dangerous. It can, women can face criminal sanctions as a result of it. They sometimes face defamation charges, ostracism, including from their own families. Sometimes they get death threats. They face attack or even worse, assassination. And I really concur with a statement that was issued by UN experts alerting the international community that a, quote, global trend of fundamentalism and populism poses increasing risks to women human rights defenders. And it's interesting, I mean, there is actually statistical support for this position. In a recent global survey, 54% of the 694 respondents, that's 54% of 694 respondents, among members of, quote, young feminist organizations, unquote, noted that they were threatened in their work by extremist or fundamentalist religious groups. That's more than half of the young women human rights defenders around the world in this survey were found to be facing threats and restrictions in their work because of these sorts of groups. So this work is rendered much more difficult by fundamentalist and extremist groups. Yet another reason why indeed this issue has to be tackled to move forward with regard to women's equality. Now, we talked about the internet earlier. The internet has created new space for women. So, for example, these videos are distributed online on YouTube, and it is exciting some of the potential ways of challenging fundamentalists and extremists, but it is unfortunately also a space where women are harassed by fundamentalists and extremists. And one of the things that many of us have been pushing for is for states to take the necessary action to exercise due diligence to make sure that women can participate in equality and safety on the internet, even when raising issues of fundamentalism and extremism, and so that they have safe spaces to counter fundamentalist and extremist discourses in cyberspace, such as to post these kinds of videos. But I think we are a long way away from that actually materializing. One of the issues that I took up when I looked at this, and let me find a good slide for that, is the right of women to participate in religious leadership. This was a tricky issue to raise at the UN, but I was really committed not only to sort of fighting for women's rights, to defend human rights on secular grounds, on the grounds of universal human rights, but also to find an equal place within their own religious traditions. And it's really amazing to see what different women are doing around the world, whether it's in Israel, the Women of the Wall, who have been fighting for the right to equal access to sacred sites in Judaism, and sometimes have been facing tremendous pushback from ultra-Orthodox groups in particular, but really have refused to give up. We've seen this with Muslim women, a wonderful organization. I think I might have their logo there, Sisters in Islam, that is engaged in feminist reinterpretation of the Quran. So we're seeing women just fighting for the right to participate in religious leadership and religious interpretation. And I said very clearly in my report to the General Assembly, which interestingly, of course, the report about women was much more controversial than the general report about fundamentalism, but the report about the impact of fundamentalism on women was a much harder sell. But one of the things that I said was that women's equal right to take part in cultural life includes their equal right to be religious and spiritual leaders. And I know this was a controversial point, but it seemed to me to be incredibly important, because what message precisely are we sending when we say, for reasons of what we call or we claim to be tradition or culture or religion, that women are excluded from that leadership? That is definitely sending a message about the second-class status of women, a message which is very undermining. And so it was incredibly important for me to make that point in the report. Another difficult point that I wanted to make, and well, I'll just go to this slide and not flip around anymore, that I wanted to make was about the relationship of all of this to women's sexual and reproductive rights. And my area is cultural rights in the UN, so I couldn't go too far in this direction, but I wanted to make absolutely clear that it is virtually impossible for women to participate in equality in cultural life without being able to control their own reproductive capacity. I mean, then it is very hard to access many cultural events, to participate in public the way that you would want to find yourself in an equal status. And so I couldn't go all the way into these rights, sexual and reproductive rights, in the way that some of the other UN bodies do. But I cited some of the work of the other bodies. So, for example, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in the UN, and another UN Human Rights Committee, which is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, has found that denying women and girls contraception or abortion services, or forcing girls into early marriage, denies them the right to control their fertility and sexuality, which also affects their full enjoyment of all of their economic, social, and cultural rights, including their right to access education on an equal basis with men. women. And I think this is a critically important area that we have to think about. I know that this is an issue much debated here in Georgia and other parts of this country and around the world, across Latin America, increasingly in Eastern Europe as well. And in fact, when the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of assembly looked at some of the challenges that fundamentalist movements were posing to freedom of assembly around the world, what he found is the biggest challenges faced women's organizations that were trying to champion reproductive and sexual rights, that they were facing more than any other civil society groups in the world threats to their right to freedom of assembly from fundamentalist and extremist groups. And he looked in particular at what was happening in Latin America in this regard. But it's not only in that region. There's also evidence, for example, that in Sri Lanka, there has been a lot of pressure on sexual and reproductive rights in a different direction, in this way trying to valorize Buddhist women having babies and suggest that Muslim women should not have babies because there is Sinhala Buddhist ethno-nationalism. So there is this desire to have sort of more Buddhist children, fewer Muslim minority children, and this is the way that the reproductive rights debate has played itself out there. And there's been a real demonization of the fertility of Muslim women. And I think when we look across regions, what we see is that diverse fundamentalists and extremists are promoting the cultural stigmatizing of women for exercising and advocating for sexual and reproductive rights, ultimately creating a culture of shame rather than the culture of equality that we really so greatly need. So what then should we do about all of this? Well, one thing I think is very clear to me from all my travels, from all these stories that I've heard, that I've tried to share, is that we can never assume, and here I'm quoting from a Polish women's rights defender, we can never assume that in any country rights are won for good. We must continue to raise awareness, as she said, of what may be taken away from us. We like to think of progress in human rights as being sort of constantly moving forward. I think what we've seen in the women's human rights area, and in some other areas, but definitely in the women's human rights area, is that there can be a trajectory forward at times, and then just when you least expect it, just when you think somehow equality has been achieved, a trajectory backward. And so we all have a responsibility to keep this agenda advancing. I think, as I said this morning, we again need a really concerted effort at the international level to challenge fundamentalist and extremist backlash against women's rights. And there are many different things that I mentioned in my report, including urgent action measures that need to be taken when women particularly come under attack, or women rights defenders particularly come under attack. But I think if I had to pick only one thing, if I had to emphasize only one thing from the report, it is the importance, the criticality of non-sexist education, right? Education that emphasizes the importance of gender equality. And I think that that is one of the most central things that governments need to defend and need to expand to be able to really face up to the fundamentalist onslaught against women's human rights. And I think that that is one of the, I hope will be one of the top priorities, and that we can continue to raise in the UN system. So I think, again, as I used the phrase this morning, we have to take this all as a wake-up call for our times. And we have to find ways to respond as individuals, as communities of conscience, as countries, and really bear in mind what that Polish woman rights defender said about not assuming that we have these rights, that they are won for good, that they can't be taken away. But I do think that hope is critically important. I said this this morning, I said this in the middle talk, and I'm going to end on a note of hope again. I think hope is critically important in all of this, even in this time of backlash against women's rights, a backlash against minority rights, as we discussed earlier in the day. And I think I put in a slide related to hope. These are all sad slides, but let me see if I can put in my slide Well, I guess I didn't. Well, what does that tell you? I didn't put in a particular slide related to hope, so we will go back to this picture, which actually is very hopeful because these women did win in the Supreme Court. I think that hope, or what Algerians often talk about as political hope, is a vital aspect of human rights work. I think it's a vital aspect of any form of spirituality. It's sometimes hard to find, but I do see it. I do see it as I travel the world for the UN, as I travel the world for my academic research. I see it in the tremendous advances made in the field of women's human rights during my lifetime, though implementation still lags and we face this terrible backlash now. I see it in the work of women human rights defenders, such as a group called Southall Black Sisters in the UK, related to the protest group I showed you the picture of, that recently won a landmark judgment against gender segregation in a religious school in that country. I see it in the young Sudanese women who have been utterly fearless in leading the charge against repression by the fundamentalist government and now by the generals there in recent demonstrations. I see it in the Irish women who strategically organized for passage of the recent referendum on abortion rights in their country, really against the odds. And they didn't just sort of suddenly do this. They did this through years of organizing in favor of reproductive rights in their country. If all of these women on all of these different front lines keep working for justice, how can we despair? I mean, this is what I sort of try to tell myself. What possible right do I have to despair? And I always remember an Afghan woman human rights defender who I interviewed in Kabul. And as I said, I always gave people the option. I can use your name if you feel comfortable, and I absolutely do not have to use your name if you don't. She was in such a bad security situation at the time that I interviewed her that she asked me, in fact, not to use her name. But I'll never forget, I always asked everyone the question who was doing this work, are you hopeful? Are you hopeful? I mean, in some ways it's a ridiculous question, but I guess personally I really wanted to know, are you hopeful? And so I asked this very at-risk woman human rights defender in Kabul from a minority group on top of that, you know, was she positive or negative in her outlook? And she said something to me that I will absolutely never forget. She said, optimism is key to survival. And I think that that's absolutely true in relation to all of these ideas and issues that we have been talking about today. I think maintaining an optimistic vision and purveying and sharing an optimistic vision in the face of the rising tides of fundamentalism and extremism is critically important in terms of building opposition to those ideologies, which for the most part I think have a very negative message. And so finding a way to have a positive message and a positive outlook is very important. And please don't mistake what I'm saying. I don't mean being Pollyanna. I mean, I'm really talking about what I like to call vigilant optimism. That is being absolutely clear the gravity of the risks and the threats and the danger that you're facing, and remaining utterly committed to the fact that there is something that we together can do about those threats and those risks. And really maintaining our conviction in the idea that a better future remains possible if we work together in dignity and equality, and most of all, if we promote hope in the face of hate. Thank you very, very much. So I actually did end sort of on time this time, and I would love to hear questions, comments, thoughts about your takeaway, action, agenda items that you might be taking away with you.
You were talking about the rising tide of fundamentalism in a number of countries, in particular in Turkey, and I was wondering if you could describe some countries where fundamentalism has been successfully controlled, or role models for countries, because you not only mentioned Turkey, you also mentioned the U.S. as places where fundamentalism is rising. And then if later on you have another question you can answer, I'd be interested in knowing what kind of legal work you've been doing, just examples of the kind of cases you may have been handling that are working against fundamentalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you for accepting the invitation to come. You had a choice. And the takeaway is much more than I can express. And so I really, again, just thank you for accepting the invitation to be here. My frame of reference really is just the United States in terms of the struggles that we've been going through, and recently in the last 3 years, much more profound. And I've been sitting here today, and I'm going, okay, she's going to get to the answers now. She's going to get to, what do we do? How do we do this? And again, what I'm realizing, it's really my not waiting for somebody else to do it. It's my responsibility to do it. We were talking at lunch with respect to the right to vote, that we were granted the right to vote, that a group of people got together to vote on whether or not we had the right to vote. And so those struggles, just in the recent times, it's important for me to communicate that to my niece and to other women and younger women in terms of the struggles that have come before them. You have to have hope. Otherwise, there's really no life worth living. I look at the courage of women in terms of the risk that they're taking for their life, their children, their family, and then I look at, put myself in a situation of, can I do that? Would I be able to do that? And from my experience, what is my risk? What have I lost? So I really, it's in terms of equal rights for women, and I can't equate in terms of the level of suffering and oppression and suppression that the examples of some of these women have gone through, or some of these people have gone through. And I wonder a lot about just the United States in terms of where are we with respect to our responsibility, our individual responsibility of talking at the dinner table, of talking to our spouses, talking to people that we know about bringing up these topics, of opening up that dialogue, of incivility, of, well, I mentioned about fear, about understanding perhaps where the other person's coming from. You don't have to accept it, but understand at least where they're coming from, and then begin that dialogue. So again, I appreciate so much of a lot of what you've brought to us today.
Thank you very much.
I want to echo what she said. I used to be very active in community affairs, and I must admit, since I've retired in many, many ways. But I think your presentation pointed out the importance and the difference one person can make, both in fundamentalism, women's rights, everything. And I thank you for a very well thought out and presented presentation. And I think I'll come out of retirement and start speaking up more.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just a brief comment. I think my takeaway would be to reach back to the next generation, the 30-somethings. As a child of the 60s, we did all kinds of walking around in the streets and writing letters and so forth. And I remember my brother saying, I got to Vietnam, it's a mess over here. Get me out of here. So I think being pragmatic, the way to do it is to reach back to the next generation that's coming up, the millennials, and bridge that from the boomers to the millennials.
Thank you. There's a hand two hands in the back. 3. Oh.
This may not be relevant to your last talk, but on the whole topic, I didn't know what your ideas were, what your opinion was of what was happening in France, how they had to install a law to stop women from wearing the veil or any indication of being a Muslim. The reason I'm asking is I'm I was born in Montreal, so I have many relatives in Quebec, French Canada, and they are definitely considering this law to be implemented. My understanding is that the consideration is quite strong because some fundamentalists from the Muslim side have tried to impose on their school system that teachers that are Muslim wear the veil. So I didn't know if you had any opinion on that, if you were aware of what it is, or if that's even a good solution to that fundamentalist Muslim who is wanting to impose the veil versus that freedom of being able to wear it.
I think there was one last hand there.
Yeah, so my takeaway from this is, I sit here and I look at all of us, and I don't see a lot of diversity, and I don't see a lot of diversity in age. And one of the things that I think I'm going to take away from this is being involved in the youth and the church is to find a way when we are able to have these type of sacred, crucial conversations and discussions within our communities, whether they be our faith-based communities or we find something else within our community, is to have the children involved too, is to have those discussions of tolerance and inclusivity and history, which is what I'm hearing from you, is that people don't even understand, your students now don't even understand all that happened with 9/11. That we have that intergenerational discussion, and we have our elders there with our children, and we have that sense of connection, because I think that's what happened to this young boy. Even though he had his mother and he had his uncle, he still was looking for that place of connection and community and place that he belonged, and did not feel it even when he had, family right next to him.
Well, maybe I'll just reply quickly, or do you want to get one more in? Sure, go for it.
On the subject of education, I was cruising the internet about a week ago, came across an article with a graphic. Did not read the article, but the graphic said that the total number of women holding college degrees in this country exceeded the total number of men holding college degrees. Now, and the trajectory was ahead. Do you have any thoughts or comments of what that kind of thing does for women's rights in this country?
Well, thank you for a very thoughtful set of comments and questions, and I have to apologize in advance and confess I am a little tired, as wonderful as this day has been, and so I hope my answers or suggestions toward answers will be articulate. Please forgive me if they're less articulate than they might have been at 10 o'clock this morning. So let me start with the interesting question about sort of role models of their countries that seem to be really defeating fundamentalism, or even in historical examples that we can point to. I mean, I would look back at Algeria in the 90s, the situation that I described to you that my father lived in, as a partial success. There was a success in the society in terms of defeating armed jihadism. And that success came about in part because of the role of the Algerian military, although I have to say that military also committed some very grave human rights abuses in the course of responding to terrorism, but also did, in some instances, finally sort of manage to protect the civilian population. But largely that victory over the jihadist armed groups happened because of the mobilization of people. Ordinary people. So eventually there were, and I showed you one picture of a demonstration, there were popular demonstrations of thousands of ordinary people. They weren't political activists. They were just people who couldn't stand it anymore, that the local policeman and the local imam and the local teacher were being killed by extremists. They just couldn't stand it. And they mobilized with those women activists and others and went out to the street and protested. And so when the fundamentalist group said, it's forbidden to take your children to school, we're shutting down all the schools, basically people said, forget you, and they showed up at school. Mothers started taking their children to school, and they would stand outside the school and wait for those kids. The society just said no. And I think that was almost as important a factor as the role of the military. I have to qualify that very carefully, though, because what has now happened is that while the worst of Armed jihadism was defeated in Algeria and the security situation became much better by the early 2000s, socially fundamentalism actually really succeeded. The normalization of a lot of fundamentalist ideas that I talked about, tragically, that has now happened in Algeria. And so you have this very paradoxical situation of a society which rejected jihadism, but then ended up really sort of ingesting, unfortunately, a lot of fundamentalist ideas. And people are quite concerned about, where that will all lead eventually. So a partial role model. Then I look to the neighbor, and that's Tunisia. And I think that Tunisia is a remarkable example of what can be achieved in mobilizing against fundamentalism. So we saw in Tunisia this very brave movement in 2011 that overthrew Ben Ali, which was a very repressive government, more towards the secular end of things. And in the environment after the overthrow of Ben Ali, the Tunisian fundamentalists, the Ennahda party, pushed forward and tried to really take advantage of that moment of democratizing and move in. And civil society blocked them. They just out-organized them. So they wanted to. Tunisia has some of the most progressive inheritance law and family law of any Muslim majority country. And the fundamentalists wanted to start undoing that. Women's movement said it's not happening. It's just not happening. And they mobilized and they out-mobilized the fundamentalists. Now, that's an ongoing battle. The fundamentalists may yet prevail in Tunisia. Tragically, their very elderly president in his 90s has just died, and no one is quite sure what's going to happen in the upcoming election. But I think the lesson from Tunisia is, again, the power of civil society mobilization. I mean, all those activists are exhausted. Every time I go to Tunisia and I try to meet with somebody, they're all completely exhausted, but they understood the moment is now and the person is me. And if it's not now, it's not going to happen. And if it's not me, who is going to do it? And so I showed you the picture of the little Tunisian girl protesting against fundamentalist assassinations. There have been more since then, but at that point there had been 2 or 3 assassinations in Tunisia, which were horrible. There was assassination of a very prominent human rights lawyer named Shukri Belaid, who paradoxically had in the past, during the Ben Ali government, defended Salafist prisoners, but he was also a communist and an atheist, and he was a very outspoken critic of the fundamentalists, and when they started trying to take power, he opposed them, and he was assassinated. And there was also an assassination of a very devout, religious, but secular Muslim politician named Muhammad Ibrahimi. And those 2 assassinations completely mobilized Tunisian society. They looked around, they said, we're not going to be Syria here, it's not happening. There was mass mobilization. I was in Tunisia when one of those assassinations happened, mass mobilization against those assassinations, and thankfully, they have not continued. Now, there is other violence and there are security risks in Tunisia, but I think, to me, if I had to look really for a role model, and Tunisia is still a fragile, small country in a very difficult strategic and security context regionally. I'm not saying they're out of the water, but I think there is a lot we can learn from what has happened there. And to the very kind people who thank me for coming, thank you for coming, thank you for inviting me. It's really inspiring to me to keep doing this work when I find that these ideas and these stories are meaningful to people, and when I find people who are so thoughtfully engaging with ideas. And I was saying to somebody in the colloquy in the ladies' restroom earlier, I was saying that you guys really need to replicate your model and think about even webcasting and, sponsoring similar groups to do the same thing in other parts of the country. I think you've really created something that is very precious. And somebody was talking about sacred conversations. I think this is actually, for me, has been a very sacred conversation today. And the fact of having ongoing, in-depth, serious conversation, even where people aren't necessarily all on the same page, is such a critical part of all of this. In terms of, my thinking about what to do and how to give a blueprint, the best thing that I know to do is to offer some general solutions, and then I think people have to figure out what makes the most sense in their own context. And so I think it's possible to generalize about some of this, and I've tried to do that, but I think figuring out how to tackle it also has to really look at the specificity of the context people are working in. One thing I would say in looking at this country, and My goodness, cards on the table. I mean, I'll just say this. I often have said in the last couple of years that I have watched through the eyes of my two parents the pain of watching the rise of extremism in your home country. My father lived through it, and now my mother is living through it. And I've seen how much, I mean, I'm not saying it's the same thing. It's a totally different situation. In Algeria, you ended up with an armed conflict that killed 200,000 people. When people sort of joke here or use the paradigm civil war, I get very angry because I know what a civil war looks like. And of course, people in this part of the country remember all too well what a civil war looks like. That is not at all the situation we're in, and we don't want to go anywhere near it. But I mean, I understand that people feel very deeply, gravely concerned here. And when I try to think of solutions here, one thing that seems to me to be incredibly important is local organizing, because fundamentalists and extremists have been very good at doing that around the world. They take the local very seriously. They do grassroots advocacy. Yes, they do use social media, but they also go out and talk to people and have meetings and are in spaces and creating spaces, and the people who oppose them have to outdo them in all of those things to be able to compete. So, you know, that's my very humble suggestion of what some of what needs to be done here. But I also think the lady in the back mentioned civil conversation. I do think it's so important. And I was actually really shocked. Cindy McCain wrote, I don't know if any of you saw it, this op-ed in memory of her late husband calling for civil conversation. And I was looking on Twitter at the attacks on her for simply having called for civility. And whether one agreed or disagreed with John McCain about this or that, the point is, here's a person who's writing on behalf of her late husband who, you know, was for some people a war hero, and it was shocking to me, the responses, the really uncivil responses that she was getting, both from the right and from the left on social media. And if we can't even have a civil conversation, how do we come together to find solutions? I do think civility is very important, not as a way of papering over the cracks or pretending the problems are less grave than they are, but as being able to find truly democratic solutions. And I have to say, I do think the incivility goes both ways. I mean, I think it is very extreme coming from the far right, but I will say very honestly, and I know the camera's rolling, you know, I teach at a university in Northern California, and I will tell you, I am sometimes shocked what I hear people in California saying about people in other parts of the country, like the Midwest. And the incivility goes, unfortunately, in multiple directions, and I think we've got to tackle that. I think it is critically important. And so creating spaces where we can speak with people who have different ideas, not accepting those ideas and recognizing that there are red lines and there are people for whom such dialogues would not be safe because of who they are. Nevertheless, where possible, I do think that that's critically important. And I'm so glad that so many of you referenced the importance of working with the next generation. One thing that I did find in doing my research that was disturbing was a huge generation gap. So a lot of the people that I met who've been doing this work are older. They're sort of 40s and up. And then there were some younger activists like Nurjahan Akbar, who you saw, but they were often very disconnected from those movements. And how you bridge that gap in both directions seems to me very important. And I remember being in Algeria in 2011, there were some pro-democracy demonstrations that unfortunately weren't successful, and now they're ongoing this year. But I was at a meeting attended by some older women activists, probably in their 50s and 60s, my age and up, and then some young bloggers, young male bloggers in their 20s. And one of the male bloggers looked at one of the women and he said, you know what? We need to learn from your experience, and you need our energy. And I think it's those kind of bridges and sharing and intergenerational spaces that we absolutely need to create to keep this forward. And I'm sure I've missed a question, but I didn't know if you wanted to go back to the audience or do you want to stop there? Anyway, let me say for one last time, thank you so much for listening today.